June 18, 1944. Camp Hearn, Texas. The smell hit him before the guard spoke. It came through the open truck bed in a slow, steady wave, warm grease coffee, something baked. Not the sour reek of boiled turnips or wet wool, not the sharp sting of disinfectant he had learned to associate with processing yards and holding pens. This was fuller than that, domestic, almost careless in its confidence. He tightened his grip on the canvas strap at his shoulder. The truck rolled to a stop. Boots thudded against packed earth. Somewhere a man laughed short and unguarded as if nothing here required restraint. He waited for the shout. It was what he had been taught to expect. The first command barked loud enough to scatter thoughts. The second louder. Then the cane, the butt of a rifle the humiliation delivered in front of everyone, so the lesson would stick. Silence came first, yes, but only as a breath drawn before the strike. Instead, a voice said, "All right, boys, one at a time." Not loud, not sharp, just ordinary. He blinked. The truck gate dropped. A line formed without being screamed into existence. Men climbed down boots, finding ground, each movement watched but not rushed. The guard closest to him did not grab an arm or shove a shoulder. He pointed. The finger was relaxed, the gesture practiced. "Over there. Keep it moving." The word keep landed oddly. Not hurry, not now, keep. As he stepped down, the smell deepened. Coffee for sure, bread, something frying. His stomach tightened in a way he did not trust. Hunger had taught him caution. Hunger had taught him that good smells were tricks. He looked for the wire. There it was, double fencing, clean lines, posts sunk straight. Towers stood at intervals, guards visible, but still. Rifles were slung, not aimed. No dogs strained at leashes. No whistles cut the air. This is not right, he thought. This is staged. They were herded, not shoved toward a long, low building with wide doors and windows screened against insects. He had expected darkness. Instead, there was light, the kind that comes from order rather than bulbs turned up too bright. Benches were aligned. Tables stood ready. Tin cups stacked neatly. A chalkboard listed names, times, assignments. He scanned faces, waiting to see the first man made an example of. Waiting for a stumble to be punished. A German next to him whispered something too quiet to hear, but the tone was the same one he felt in his own chest, disbelief sharpening into fear. A guard walked past with a clipboard. He did not look at them as a mass. He looked at one man, then the next, checking off boxes. When he reached the end of the line, he nodded once satisfied and turned away. No inspection screams. No theatrical cruelty. Beyond the hall he saw more structures. A kitchen with steam curling out of a vent. A small building marked with a red cross its door propped open. Barracks laid out like streets. Paths worn smooth by boots, not chaos. A bulletin board held notices in 2 languages. He caught a word he knew: post. Mail. Mail he swallowed. His mouth was dry despite the smells. Somewhere behind him an engine idled, steady and patient. Somewhere ahead metal clinked plates being set down, perhaps. It sounded like preparation for living. The guard nearest him spoke again, closer this time. "You'll get tags, then chow. Work assignments after." The sentence came without menace. Chow, work, after. He waited for the insult at the end. It never arrived. He thought of the films, of the posters nailed in barracks back home, Americans with slack jaws and cruel eyes, camps run like butcheries, prisoners starved until obedience replaced thought. The certainty of it had been comforting in its way. A clear picture of what awaited them made fear manageable. This place did not fit the picture. A man ahead of him dropped his kit bag. It split, spilling socks and a photograph. The photograph slid across the floor and stopped near a guard's boot. The man froze. So did everyone else. This was the moment, the one they knew. The guard bent down. He picked up the photograph, glanced at it not long enough to mock, just long enough to understand what it was, and handed it back. "Careful," he said. "Don't lose that." The man took it with shaking hands. No blow followed. The line moved. He felt something shift, small and dangerous. Not relief. Relief would come later, if at all. This was worse. This was confusion. They were issued tags. Clean stamped the metal cool against his skin. He noticed the efficiency of it, the way each step led to the next without friction. He noticed that the guards spoke to each other the same way they spoke to the prisoners. No special register for enemies. No performance. He noticed with a start that time here seemed measured. Not stretched thin by waiting for punishment, not crushed by endless orders, but portioned out. Breakfast, work, lunch, work, evening, lights out. The rhythm of it pressed in from all sides. He had expected captivity to be loud. Instead, it was quiet in a way that suggested permanence. As he was guided toward the mess hall, the smell grew undeniable. Bacon, perhaps. Coffee without chicory. Bread that had risen properly. He did not allow himself to believe it. Belief was a liability. He took his place at the end of another line. No one shouted for silence. No one needed to. This is not a camp, his mind insisted. This is a town pretending to be a camp. The thought scared him more than any threat he had imagined on the ride over. Because if this was real, if this was how they did things here, then everything he had been told about power, about fear, about how men were controlled was about to become useless. And he did not yet know what would replace it. The first night did not bring relief. It brought vigilance. He lay on the narrow bunk with his boots lined beneath it exactly as instructed. The barracks breathed around him, wood settling a distant cough, the low murmur of men trying not to speak. Light leaked in through high windows, not enough to see faces, clearly just enough to erase darkness. He kept his eyes open. Sleep, in his experience, was when discipline arrived unannounced. In the German army, quiet had never meant peace. Quiet was the pause before inspection. The held breath before a name was called. Officers learned early that shouting lost its power if used too often. Real control came from delay, from letting the mind do the punishing first. So when nothing happened, his muscles tightened. The days followed a pattern. Wake, roll call, breakfast, work, lunch, work, supper, lights out. The pattern itself felt like bait. Each repetition sharpened his nerves. Each uneventful hour convinced him that something was being prepared. At roll call, the guards counted without ceremony. Numbers were checked. Names confirmed. When a man answered too slowly, the guard waited. He did not raise his voice. He simply waited until the answer came. The pause was worse than shouting. It left room for imagination. He watched the guards closely, how they stood, how they moved. Their hands rested near their belts but did not linger there. When they corrected a line that had drifted out of shape, they stepped in and adjusted it physically if needed, but without force. The absence of anger felt deliberate, almost calculated. This is restraint, he thought, not kindness. He remembered training fields back home. Mud churned by boots. An instructor pacing in front of them, voice raw from screaming. Mistakes punished publicly so no one would forget them. Men reduced to objects, then rebuilt into obedience. It had been brutal, yes, but it had been clear. You knew where you stood. Here, clarity was missing. On the third day, he was assigned to a work detail. The announcement came on a board near the mess hall, names written in chalk. He found his and felt the familiar drop in his stomach. Work meant exposure. Exposure meant opportunity for correction. They were marched, not rushed, beyond the inner fence, escorted by guards who walked beside them rather than behind. The land opened up. Fields stretched farther than he could easily measure. Equipment waited in neat rows. Tools leaned against posts as if they expected to be used, not guarded. A guard explained the task. He spoke slowly, demonstrating once with his own hands. No threats. No list of consequences. If you don't get it, the guard said, ask. Ask. The word landed wrong. Asking implied choice. Choice implied a margin of safety. He did not trust it. They worked. His body fell into familiar rhythms. Lift, drive, adjust. Sweat ran into his eyes. The sun pressed down, steady and impersonal. This part made sense. Labor always did. What did not make sense was the lack of oversight. Guards watched, but not constantly. Their attention moved trusted to return when needed. Trust was dangerous. He waited for the moment someone would test it. He waited for a prisoner to step out of line to confirm what he believed, that this calm was temporary. It did not happen. At lunch, they were given time. Actual time. Enough to eat without rushing, enough to drink water without stealing glances at the guards. Conversation started cautiously, then faded as men realized no one was listening for forbidden words. Even then, voices stayed low. Habits did not break easily. By the end of the week, his shoulders ached not from work but from tension. His body remained braced as if expecting a blow that refused to arrive. The constant readiness became exhausting. He caught himself flinching at ordinary sounds, a dropped tool, a door closing. At night, he dreamed of whistles and boots. He woke with his jaw clenched, the taste of metal in his mouth. He tried to make sense of it the only way he knew, by assuming strategy. America needed workers. That much was obvious. He had seen the trains. Endless cars moving west and east, loaded with things he could not name. He had heard guards talk among themselves, not bothering to lower their voices. Brothers overseas. Sons in France. 12 million men gone from towns and farms and factories. The absence left holes. Holes needed filling, so they filled them with prisoners. Efficiency, he told himself. Nothing more. This was not mercy. This was calculation. A system confident enough to be gentle because it did not feel threatened. A machine that did not need to grind loudly to prove it was running. The thought did not comfort him. It unsettled him. In Germany, power announced itself. It demanded recognition. It made noise. Here, power seemed uninterested in being noticed. It existed regardless of whether anyone acknowledged it. That was new, and new things were dangerous. One afternoon, a man near him stumbled. His tool slipped. The mistake was small, almost invisible. Still, the man froze, waiting. Everyone did. The air held its breath. A guard approached. He looked at the ground, then at the tool, then at the man. "Try it this way," he said and showed him. No record, no lecture, no mark against his name. The guard moved on. The man stood there afterward, stunned hands shaking. He worked carefully for the rest of the day, not because he was afraid of punishment, but because something in him had been disturbed. He recognized that feeling. It was the same one growing in his own chest. Fear without release. The days kept coming. Each one without the expected correction made the fear heavier, not lighter. His body did not know how to stand down. Muscles stayed tight even at rest. His nerves hummed like wires under tension. He began to realize that the silence was not hiding violence. The silence was the system. Here, discipline did not arrive as an event. It was embedded in routine, in expectation, in the quiet understanding that work done poorly simply had to be done again. No one yelled because yelling was unnecessary. That idea scared him more than cruelty ever had, because cruelty could be resisted. It could be endured. It created an enemy you could see. This did not. This required something else: participation, attention, responsibility. At night, lying on his bunk, he listened to the camp settle. Somewhere, a radio played faintly music, not marching songs. Somewhere, a guard coughed. Somewhere a train horn sounded, far away, moving on without pause. He realized with a tightening in his chest that the fear he felt was not of being beaten. It was the fear of being expected to function without being broken first. And he did not yet know if he could. So he stayed tense. He stayed ready. He waited for the day the calm would end. Because in his experience, calm was never free. It was only delayed. It did not happen all at once. That was what unsettled him most. If the Americans had chosen one grand moment, one dramatic gesture meant to impress or disarm, he would have dismissed it as theater. A performance for prisoners, a calculated display. He was trained to recognize spectacle. Spectacle always demanded an audience. This did not. The first instance was so small he almost missed it. He was assigned to a different task, one that required repetition more than strength. His hands moved the way they had been taught, but the sequence was wrong. Not disastrously wrong, just inefficient. The kind of error that back home would have earned a barked insult and a reminder shouted loudly enough for everyone else to hear. A guard stopped beside him. He felt it immediately, the tightening behind the eyes, the involuntary draw of the shoulders. His body prepared for what always came next. Nothing came. The guard pointed. "Watch," he demonstrated once, slowly, then again from a slightly different angle as if understanding required perspective rather than obedience. "Try again." The words were neutral, almost encouraging. There was no audience gathered for his mistake, no ledger being marked. He did it again. Better this time. "That's okay," the guard said, and moved on. "Okay." The word followed him through the rest of the day. It echoed in his head out of place among the sharper sounds he had grown used to. He told himself not to dwell on it. Singular moments proved nothing. But then it happened again. Another day, another task. A man near him misjudged a measurement. The result was uneven. A guard noticed. He waited for the explosion. Instead, the guard knelt down, adjusted the placement, and said, "If you start here, it lines up cleaner. No accusation. No implication of incompetence. Just a correction offered like information." The man nodded and continued. The guard stayed long enough to see it done, right then walked away. There was no follow-up, no later reckoning. The kindness did not arrive as relief. It arrived as irritation. It disrupted his expectations, which felt safer than uncertainty. He began to watch more carefully. The guards corrected each other the same way. Quiet reminders, demonstrations. No one lost face. No one needed to assert dominance. Mistakes were treated as inefficiencies, not moral failures. At first he thought it was because they were Americans dealing with Americans. Then he realized it did not change when they dealt with prisoners. The system did not shift tone. That was the difference. Back home, rank decided voice. Volume traveled downward. Orders flowed one way. Respect was enforced through distance and noise. Here the distance was smaller, the noise almost absent. He started to notice how things were arranged. Tools were stored in consistent places. Instructions were posted clearly, not barked repeatedly. When something went wrong, the question was not who failed, but where the process failed. He had no words for it yet, but something familiar stirred in the back of his mind. He had seen this logic before, not in the army, but in stories, accounts of factories of assembly lines that ran day and night, machines that did not care who you were, only whether you performed the step correctly. Here, men were treated the same way, not as interchangeable parts, but as participants in a system that assumed competence could be taught rather than beaten into existence. The kindness continued unremarkable in its consistency. A guard noticed him favoring one arm and adjusted the load without comment. Another handed out gloves when the morning turned colder, not as a concession, but as a matter of course. When someone lagged, the line slowed, not dramatically, just enough. No speeches accompanied these acts. No smiles demanding gratitude. They were done the way one adjusted a loose bolt quietly because leaving it loose would cause problems later. That was when it began to sink in. This was not generosity. It was maintenance. He thought of the rumors he had heard even before capture, of American factories turning out planes faster than anyone thought possible, of ships built in days, not months, of schedules kept not by fear, but by habit. He had dismissed those stories as exaggeration, propaganda of a different sort. Now he wondered. In the German army, discipline was personal. Failure was shameful. Correction was loud. Men learned quickly because pain shortened the lesson. Here, discipline was impersonal. Failure was expected. Correction was procedural. Men learned because learning was required. The difference was subtle. It was also enormous. He began to feel it in his own body. The tension did not disappear, but it shifted. His shoulders still tensed at sudden movement, but they no longer stayed locked all day. His hands steadied. His breath came easier during work. He did not trust this change. Trust, he believed, was what got people hurt. So he waited for kindness to stop. It did not. Instead, it accumulated. Day after day, small interventions smoothed rough edges. Mistakes were caught, early corrected without spectacle. Efficiency increased not because anyone demanded it, but because it made the work easier. He found himself adjusting his own movements not out of fear, but to avoid wasting effort. He noticed when others struggled and offered help without being told. This surprised him more than anything the guards had done. Helping without orders had once been dangerous. Here it was expected. At lunch one afternoon he overheard a guard speaking to another about his brother overseas. The tone was matter-of-fact, not heroic. Work to be done. Duty shared. Loss endured without ceremony. There was no triumphant language, no talk of destiny, just responsibility. He realized then that what he was witnessing was not kindness as mercy. It was kindness as infrastructure. A society that assumed people would perform better if treated as capable. A system that conserved energy by not wasting it on humiliation. Authority that did not need to announce itself because it was already secure. This unsettled him more deeply than shouting ever could, because shouting made enemies. This made participants. One evening, as the sun dropped and shadows stretched across the camp, he caught himself finishing a task carefully even though no one was watching. The realization stopped him cold. He was not afraid of being punished. He simply did not want to do the work badly. The thought felt treacherous. It contradicted everything he had learned about motivation, about control. He lay awake that night replaying the day not for errors but for improvements. His mind cataloged small adjustments he could make tomorrow. This frightened him, because if kindness worked not as an exception but as a rule, then fear had never been necessary. And if fear had never been necessary, then much of what he had accepted as inevitable was simply chosen. The kindness continued to repeat itself. Small, boring, relentless. It did not ask to be noticed. And slowly, against his will, he began to believe that this was not a performance meant to disarm prisoners. It was simply how things were done here, which meant it was not going away. That realization settled in his chest with a weight he did not yet understand. Not comfort, not relief, something more dangerous, something that would demand a reckoning later. He did not know it yet, but his fear was changing shape, and when it finally broke, it would not break the way fear usually did. It happened on an ordinary morning. That was the worst part. No warning. No heightened tension. No storm in the air. The sun rose the same way it had every day that week, steady, indifferent. The schedule did not change. Breakfast tasted the same. The work detail was announced without emphasis. Ordinary days were supposed to be safe. He was assigned to a task he had done before. His hands knew the motions. His body had learned the rhythm. He worked with the quiet focus he had developed since arriving, careful not to draw attention, careful not to waste effort. Then he made a mistake. It was small, a misjudged angle, a fraction off. The kind of error that revealed itself only after the motion was complete, when it was too late to correct without starting over. He saw it instantly. His body reacted before his mind did. His shoulders drew inward. His neck tightened. His head dropped chin toward chest, eyes fixed on the ground. He felt the old reflex take over, the one carved into him by years of conditioning. Wait. Endure. Do not move. His muscles locked. His breath stalled halfway in. This was the moment. He felt it the way animals feel the shadow of a predator passing overhead. The pause before violence. The charged silence that had always come right before impact. He did not look up. He could not. Boots approached. He heard them stop beside him. Time stretched. Nothing happened. No shout cut the air. No hand grabbed his collar. No blow came crashing down on his back or shoulders. The absence pressed against him heavier than any strike. A voice spoke. Not like that. It was close, calm, almost conversational. He flinched, despite himself, a sharp involuntary jerk that betrayed him. His heart hammered. His hands began to shake, fine tremors running through his fingers as if his body had forgotten how to hold itself together. The voice continued. Watch. Something moved in his peripheral vision. The guard stepped into his line of sight, not towering, not looming. He demonstrated the correct motion, slowly, deliberately, as if time itself had slowed to accommodate understanding. Try again. The words did not land. His mind could not process them. The pathway that usually followed a mistake, fear pain, humiliation, had been interrupted. The circuit broke mid-current, leaving energy with nowhere to go. His body started to tremble. Not the controlled tension he had lived with for weeks, but something deeper, something loose and uncontrolled. His knees felt weak. His breath came in shallow, uneven pulls. He was dimly aware of the guard waiting patiently, giving him space. Space was unbearable. He forced himself to move. His hands did not obey at first. They felt distant, unreliable, like they belonged to someone else. When he tried again, the motion was clumsy. Worse than before. That's okay, the guard said softly. Okay. The word hit him harder than any insult ever had. His vision blurred. Not with tears, not yet, but with the sensation of something slipping out of alignment. His heart raced. A cold sweat broke across his back. He felt exposed, stripped of the armor fear had always provided. He was afraid. Not of being hurt, of not being hurt. Because pain would have made sense. Pain would have confirmed the world he knew. Pain would have restored order. This did not. The guard waited a moment longer, then stepped back, leaving him alone with the task and the wreckage unfolding inside him. He stood there, shaking, unable to continue. The work around him went on. Tools moved. Men spoke quietly. No one stopped. No one stared. The world did not pause for his collapse. That, too, was unbearable. He bent forward slightly, hands braced on his knees, trying to breathe. The ground beneath him seemed too solid, too real. He felt as though he might fall through it. Images rose unbidden. Bombed streets back home. Rubble where buildings had been. The smell of smoke and dust and something sweet-sour he tried not to name. Lines of civilians waiting for food that never seemed enough. Children thinner than they should have been. Men shouting because shouting was all they had left. He remembered the sound of sirens, the way fear had been used to keep things moving when nothing else worked. Orders screamed over explosions. Discipline enforced because there was no margin for failure, no room for patience. Germany was being crushed by noise. Here there was none. Here, in a country that produced more aircraft in a year than he could imagine, silence ruled. Here, food appeared on schedule. Here even enemies were fed, housed, corrected without cruelty. The contrast struck him with physical force. His chest tightened. He straightened abruptly, panic flaring as if standing upright might restore control. It did not. His legs felt unsteady. His hands still shook. "Why aren't they hitting me?" his mind demanded, frantic now. The question spiraled, circling without landing. Because if the answer was, "they don't need to," then everything he had believed about strength was wrong. He had been taught that power had to announce itself, that it had to dominate visibly, audibly, that silence was weakness. But here, silence was confidence. He remembered overhearing guards talk about factories, about production schedules that never slept, about brothers overseas flying planes built faster than the enemy could destroy them, about ships launched before the paint dried, 96,000 aircraft in a year. The number had sounded unreal when he first heard it. Propaganda, he had assumed. Exaggeration. Now he saw the logic behind it. A system that did not waste energy on intimidation. A discipline that did not depend on fear. A society that functioned because it trusted its processes, not because it terrified its people. That realization was too much. His breath came in ragged bursts. His hands finally stilled, not because he had regained control, but because he had run out of strength to resist. He felt hollowed out, like something essential had drained away. He lowered himself onto a nearby crate head in his hands. No one rushed him. No one demanded an explanation. The guard who had corrected him glanced over once, then continued with his own work. The absence of attention felt like mercy and indictment at the same time. He sat there shaking as the day moved forward around him. For the first time since his capture, he understood what it meant to be defeated without being crushed. The breakdown did not come with noise. It did not announce itself. It arrived quietly, dismantling him piece by piece. Fear had always given him structure. Fear had told him how to stand, how to breathe, how to survive. Now, fear had nowhere to attach. And without it, he did not know who he was supposed to be. When he finally stood again, his movements were slow, deliberate, as if he were learning to inhabit his body anew. He finished the task. Not perfectly, but correctly. No one commented. The day ended the way it always did. Tools returned, lines formed, supper served. The sun dipped low, painting long shadows across the camp. That night, lying on his bunk, he stared at the ceiling, his body exhausted in a way it had never been before. Not from labor, from collapse. He realized with a distant clarity that frightened him that the Americans had taken something from him without laying a hand on him. They had taken his fear, and without it, everything else was about to fall apart. The change did not announce itself. There was no moment where he stood taller, no sentence that resolved everything at once. The days simply continued, and within them something quiet rearranged itself. He woke the next morning with the same ache in his shoulders and the same dust in his mouth. The barracks smelled of wood and damp clothes. Men rose, boots slid onto feet, belts buckled. The routine held. It always did. What did not return was the old readiness. His body still remembered fear, but it no longer obeyed it automatically. When he stepped into line, his shoulders did not creep upward. When a guard passed behind him, his breath did not catch. The absence felt unnatural at first, like a missing limb. At work, he noticed details he had ignored before. The way tools were laid out to reduce wasted movement. The way tasks were broken into steps that made sense when followed in order. The way guards watched not for failure, but for deviation from the process. He realized something uncomfortable. The system assumed he wanted to do the job correctly. That assumption carried weight. Back home, discipline had assumed resistance. Orders were designed to overcome reluctance, to crush hesitation. Compliance was extracted. Here, compliance was expected, not demanded, not negotiated. It was simply the baseline. He tested it without meaning to. He adjusted his pace, working a little more carefully, not because anyone was watching, but because it felt right to do so. When he finished early, he checked his work instead of standing idle. When a man beside him struggled, he offered a suggestion before the guard had to intervene. No one praised him. No one took note. The lack of response was the point. He began to understand that control here did not depend on visibility. It depended on reliability. The work moved forward whether anyone watched or not. The system trusted that if you were given responsibility, you would carry it. That trust was not sentimental. It was efficient. He thought back to the fear that had defined him, how it had sharpened his senses but narrowed his world. Fear had made him obedient, yes, but brittle. It had demanded constant reinforcement. It consumed energy. This did not. This conserved it. He found himself thinking the words without intending to, almost as an observation rather than a conclusion. Power did not need to humiliate. The thought surprised him with its calm. Power, as he had known it, had always been loud. It had relied on spectacle to sustain itself. It needed reminders, demonstrations, punishments made visible so no one would forget who held control. Here, power seemed uninterested in proving itself. It functioned through continuity, through the quiet confidence that tomorrow would resemble today and the day after that would resemble tomorrow. He saw it everywhere once he learned how to look. In the way food arrived on time. In the way medical care was offered without bargaining. In the way letters were distributed with the same care as tools. In the way guards corrected mistakes and then moved on trusting that the correction was enough. This was not mercy. It was design. He began to understand the people around him not individually but collectively. The guards were not saints. Some were tired, some were indifferent. Some carried grief that surfaced unexpectedly in the way they stared too long at the horizon or fell silent at the mention of overseas battles. They were not perfect, but they shared something he had not expected, a belief that systems mattered more than displays. That dignity extended consistently produced better outcomes than fear applied selectively. He thought of the men who had built this place. Not just the officers who issued orders, but the workers who poured concrete, raised barracks, stocked kitchens. Men and women who believed that even enemies required infrastructure, not improvisation. That belief astonished him. Back home, scarcity had turned every interaction into a struggle. Food had become leverage. Safety had become conditional. Fear had been the only tool left to maintain motion. Here, abundance changed the equation. He remembered hearing numbers whispered among prisoners, figures so large they sounded like fantasy. Planes produced by the tens of thousands. Factories that never slept. Fields that fed not only those who worked them, but those who fought far away, and even those who had once fought against them. He did not dwell on the numbers. He did not need to. He saw their effect in the steadiness of the camp, in the unhurried way everything was done. Abundance did not need to threaten. It could afford to be patient. He noticed that he no longer waited for the day to end. He measured time by tasks completed rather than punishments avoided. The shift unsettled him, but it also brought a strange clarity. His actions mattered here not because someone demanded they matter, but because the system relied on them. Responsibility, he realized, was heavier than fear. Fear could be endured passively. Responsibility required engagement. He began to take pride in small things. In a task finished cleanly. In a line straightened without being told. In a correction offered to another man that was accepted without resentment. This pride did not announce itself. It did not swell. It settled. He understood then why the breakdown had frightened him so deeply. It was not the absence of punishment that had undone him, but the presence of expectation. He had been conditioned to respond to threats. He had not been prepared to respond to trust. Trust demanded something of him. It demanded that he see himself as capable. That was dangerous territory. At night, lying in his bunk, he thought of his family scattered now by war and loss. He thought of streets reduced to rubble of voices raised in desperation. He thought of how easily fear had taken root there, how it had seemed like the only way to keep people moving forward when everything else failed. He did not condemn it. He understood it. But he also saw now another way. A way that did not depend on breaking people down before building them up. A way that assumed competence, then reinforced it through routine rather than force. He had no language for it beyond what he felt. Quiet strength. He watched the guards differently now. Not as potential threats, but as participants in the same mechanism he was part of. They followed the same schedules. They answered to the same processes. Their authority did not free them from responsibility. It bound them to it. That realization shifted something fundamental. This was not benevolence bestowed from above. It was a culture that placed limits on power by embedding it within structure. He did not romanticize it. He knew this system existed because the country that built it was winning, because it could afford to treat enemies this way, because confidence made restraint possible. Still, the restraint was real, and it mattered. As the weeks passed, his fear receded, not because he had proven himself safe, but because safety no longer needed to be proven daily. The routine carried him. The expectations were clear. The consequences were predictable and mild. He worked better now. Not faster necessarily, but more attentively. Errors still happened, but they no longer felt catastrophic. They were simply problems to be solved. He realized one afternoon that he had stopped counting the days. The war continued elsewhere. Bombs still fell. Men still died. None of that changed. What changed was his understanding of what strength could look like. Not loud, not cruel, not afraid of its own humanity. When the thought surfaced again, power did not need to humiliate it, no longer frightened him. It steadied him. And somewhere beyond the fences, in a country that had built its power on production cooperation and an unglamorous faith in systems, that idea continued to operate, quietly shaping outcomes without demanding recognition. He was living inside it now, and for the first time he understood that this too was a kind of victory. Time in the camp did not blur. It clarified. Days followed one another with a steadiness that felt intentional. Not hurried, not lax. The same rhythms repeated not because they had to be enforced, but because everyone expected them to. Morning lines formed without shouting. Tools were returned to the same hooks. Meals arrived hot and on schedule. Lights went out when they were supposed to. No one applauded this order. No one commented on it. It simply worked. From his place inside it, he began to notice how much depended on things not being watched. Guards did not stand over every task. They circulated, yes, but their attention drifted naturally, confident it could. Prisoners worked without chains, without constant counting. Mistakes were corrected early, quietly, before they became problems. Trust was not declared. It was assumed, then confirmed through repetition. The camp ran like a mechanism that had been tested and refined long before he arrived. Beyond the fences, he could hear the world moving. Trains passed at regular intervals, their whistles distant but insistent. Trucks came and went, bringing supplies without ceremony. Paperwork moved through offices. Orders were posted, followed, replaced. Nothing about it felt improvised. He thought of how much coordination this required. How many hands had to agree implicitly on what needed to be done next? How many people had to show up on time, do their part, then trust others to do the same? This trust did not feel fragile. It felt institutional. He watched guards trade shifts without confusion. He watched medics tend to prisoners with the same efficiency they used on their own. He watched mail handed out methodically, names called letters passed over without commentary. Letters mattered here. Not because they were emotional, but because they were expected. Systems existed to make sure they arrived. He had never seen that before. Back home, systems had fractured under strain. Rules had multiplied as trust vanished. Oversight had tightened as faith in individual responsibility eroded. Everything required supervision because nothing was believed to function on its own. Here, the opposite seemed true. Rules existed, but they were not the point. The point was flow, keeping things moving, reducing friction, making sure tomorrow looked like today because today worked. He began to understand that the kindness he had experienced was not separate from this structure. It was a byproduct of it. A system designed to function smoothly had no use for cruelty. Cruelty disrupted schedules. It created resentment. It required attention. This system conserved attention. He noticed how rarely guards raised their voices. When they did, it was to be heard over distance, not to assert authority. Commands were clear because they were expected to be followed, not because they were feared. Authority here did not posture. It operated. He thought of the scale involved, of the number of men he knew were held in places like this across the country. Hundreds of thousands scattered from one coast to the other. Fed, housed, employed, counted on to work but not broken to do so. The effort required to sustain that staggered him. This was not indulgence. It was capacity. Only a society certain of its own strength could afford to treat enemies as a logistical problem rather than a moral emergency. Only a system confident in its output could choose restraint over spectacle. He saw it in small things. In the way, food portions were consistent, not extravagant, not stingy. In the way, medical supplies were stocked, replenished before shortages appeared. In the way, equipment was maintained, repaired before it failed. Nothing waited for crisis. Problems were anticipated, not dramatized. He began to recognize the same logic in the guards themselves. Many were young, some were older. Some carried themselves with ease, others with quiet fatigue. They shared little in common beyond their role, yet the role itself seemed to carry them. They trusted the camp to run whether or not they were exceptional. This was not a culture that depended on heroes. It depended on participation. The prisoners sensed it too. Behavior changed subtly over time. Fewer arguments, less hoarding, less suspicion. Not because men became virtuous overnight, but because the environment did not reward dysfunction. There was nothing to gain from defiance, nothing to prove by suffering. He noticed how often guards turned their backs without concern, how often tasks were completed out of sight, how little energy was spent on reminding people of consequences. The consequences were built in. Work unfinished remained unfinished. Errors uncorrected returned to demand attention. Responsibility circled back to the one who avoided it. No spectacle, no humiliation, just reality. He remembered hearing early on a guard remark that the war would be won by production. He had dismissed it then, thinking only of battles and strategies. Now he understood the deeper meaning. Production was not only factories and machines. It was predictability, reliability, the capacity to coordinate millions of actions without chaos. It was social. This place functioned because people believed it would, because they trusted that effort would be met with structure, not abuse, because the system did not need to squeeze obedience out of fear. He thought of the distance between where he stood and the front lines, oceans away. Men fought and died elsewhere, but here the war was expressed through organization, through the quiet confidence that feeding prisoners did not weaken resolve, that restraint did not signal softness. Strength did not require constant reinforcement. It simply endured. The longer he lived inside this order, the more he felt the weight of contrast pressing in from memory. Not as anger, not even as grief, as recognition. He saw now that the world he had come from had been running on fear because it had little else left to rely on. Fear had become a substitute for capacity. Noise had replaced stability. Surveillance had replaced trust. Here, trust replaced surveillance. Not blindly, structurally. He did not frame this as judgment. He framed it as observation. Systems responded to conditions. Scarcity bred control. Abundance allowed restraint. This place was abundant in ways that went beyond food or equipment. It was abundant in confidence. Confidence that tomorrow would arrive with the same resources as today. Confidence that the machine would keep running even if one part faltered. Confidence that authority did not need to shout to be obeyed. At night, when the camp settled into its familiar hush, he lay awake listening to the distant movement of trains and thought about what kind of society could sustain this. One that believed in itself enough to be quiet. The thought did not resolve into an answer. It lingered. And in that lingering something else took shape, not a conclusion, but a question that did not need to be spoken aloud. Because the evidence was all around him, in the steady lights, in the unguarded backs, in the ordinary dignity extended without ceremony. It was enough to make anyone wonder how long such a way of operating could last. Not because it was weak, but because it demanded a kind of collective agreement that was rare and precious and easy to forget once its results were taken for granted. He did not know what the future would make of this place. He only knew that he was standing inside a version of America that did not need to explain itself, and that more than anything was what stayed with him. He returned home with less than he had left with. No uniform worth keeping, no medals, no stories of victories that could be told without lowering his voice. The train that carried him east felt older than the one that had brought him west, as if time itself had changed direction somewhere along the way. Germany was quieter now. Not the purposeful quiet of order, but the hollow quiet of exhaustion. Buildings stood where they could. Fields were worked when tools allowed. People moved carefully as if the ground itself might give way under careless steps. He did not speak much at first. When neighbors asked about captivity, he answered simply. Food, work, time. He did not linger on details. There was no appetite for complexity in those first months. Everyone carried their own losses. Comparison felt impolite. It was years later, when his children were grown enough to ask questions without fear in their eyes, that the stories began to surface. They asked him what it had been like to lose, what it felt like to be on the other side of power. He surprised himself by answering honestly. He did not speak of humiliation. He did not describe beatings or starvation. He told them about schedules, about routine, about guards who corrected mistakes by showing how something was done. They listened, confused at first. That doesn't sound like prison, one of them said. He nodded. That's what frightened me, he replied. As time passed, the stories shifted again. They became quieter, less about events and more about impressions. About how strange it was to be trusted when you expected to be broken. About the moment he realized that fear had been doing work it never needed to do. He told them about a country that fed its enemies without apology, that organized captivity as if it were a municipal responsibility rather than a moral dilemma, that treated restraint as a sign of confidence, not weakness. He did not present it as praise. He presented it as fact. His grandchildren heard these stories differently. They lived in a world that liked clarity, heroes and villains, clean endings. They wanted to know why the Americans had behaved that way, what they had gained. He did not have a satisfying answer. They didn't need to gain anything he said once. They already had what they needed. The phrase stayed with them. Years later, one of his grandchildren stood in a museum looking at photographs of camps like the one he had known. Barracks, fences, men in uniforms that did not fit the usual narrative of cruelty. The captions spoke of conventions of procedures of scale. The words felt insufficient. He remembered his grandfather's voice. Measured, unemotional, insistent on detail rather than drama. He realized then that what had been passed down was not a story of suffering but a record of restraint. That mattered. because restraint left room for gratitude. In letters written decades after the war, he saw it expressed plainly. Former prisoners thanking former guards, families acknowledging kindness that had never been required, no grand reconciliation ceremonies, just correspondence. Recognition moving quietly across old lines. This was not forgiveness in the dramatic sense. It was acknowledgement. The old man did not live to see many of these exchanges, but his words lived on retold at tables during walks in moments when history felt less like abstraction and more like inheritance. He had never claimed that his captors were perfect. He never suggested that war had been redeemed by decency. He understood too much to simplify it that way. What he offered instead was something rarer: perspective. He told them that strength did not always look like victory parades, that power could exist without spectacle, that sometimes the most consequential decisions were made not on battlefields, but in offices where people decided how to treat those who could no longer fight back. He told them that when he had been weakest, when he had expected to be reduced to something less than himself, he had instead been treated as someone capable of improvement. That memory did not erase the war, but it outlasted it. For those who heard the story from the other side, children and grandchildren of men who had worn American uniforms, it landed differently. Not as a defense, not as propaganda, but as confirmation. Confirmation that there had once been a version of their country that trusted systems over cruelty, that believed organization was a moral choice, that did not confuse loudness with authority. They did not hear it as accusation. They heard it as inheritance. A reminder that decency had once been operational, embedded, expected. The old man never framed it as a lesson. He did not say what should be done with the memory. He simply kept it intact, passing it along without embellishment. When he died, his family found little among his belongings. A few letters, a photograph long faded, notes written in careful handwriting not for publication but for remembering. In one margin, almost as an aside, he had written a sentence he never spoke aloud. Power did not need to humiliate. Those who read it felt the weight of the words not as conclusion but as invitation. An opening left deliberately unclosed. Because history, when held honestly, rarely ends with answers. It ends with a question, one that lingers across generations, waiting to be faced again. We were capable of this. Are we still?